Hey, what's up, guys? So recently I've subscribed to the Bart Ehrman blog, The History and Literature of Early Christianity, because I think Bart Ehrman is literally one of the world's best New Testament scholars of our time. So of course I'm gonna pay to get get access to his entire blog. And the good thing is you can even leave comments, and you see Ehrman he responds to your comments when you pay for the blog subscription. I think he's got different tiers like gold, platinum, silver, bronze, etc. But anyways, if you're really interested in the history or the origins of Christianity, definitely subscribe to the Bart Ehrman blog. I just pay $3.99, but he's got other levels where it's like $2.99 or I think like $10.99 or something like that. I think the highest is $10 or somewhere in that area. But anyways, well, let's just see. Let's just see real quick. Okay, so he's got different tiers. He's got the bronze for $2.99, silver for $3.99. That's what I have, and the gold membership for $4.99. So it's definitely worth it. This is like the price of like one cup of coffee or one, I don't know, like one McDonald's meal or something like that. And so instead of pigging out on that stuff, try to educate your mind on the origins of Christianity, because I think that's very important. I think it's a very important topic. But let's get into it. It says some intriguing questions about Paul's letters. Now, Ehrman says something very interesting. He says we obviously have. Now, this person was asking questions. Well, before I get to his answer, this person was asking questions, saying, "I was wondering how scholars look at the situations of Galatians 2:6-10, especially the part of the text that states they added nothing to my message. Or all they asked was that we continue remembering the poor. My primary question is, do scholars like yourself believe that the early disciples in James Jerusalem church saw eye to eye with Paul on all matters? As a secondary, why does Paul go into disputes later in Galatians 2 if they agreed on everything mentioned in Galatians 2 earlier? Now, Ehrman has a very, very good answer to this. He says, we obviously have only Paul's side of the story. So that's a big problem, because we don't have the disciples' side of the story. We don't know what the disciples believed, but we know what Paul believed, and we don't have what the disciples' really thought of Paul. All we have is what Paul thought that the disciples thought of himself. You see, so Ehrman says something very interesting. He says something very damning, or this is like very damning evidence against Paul. He says we obviously have only Paul's side of the story. What does that mean? That means we don't have Peter's side, we don't have James' side, we don't have Thomas's side, we don't have Jesus' disciples' side of the disputes, of the stories, of the gospel, etc. All we have is Paul's side of the story, Paul's side of the gospel, Paul's side of his version of Jesus. You see, so this is a big problem, because how do we know what the disciples believed? How do we know what the disciples were teaching, were preaching, what they were preaching about Jesus, etc.? So Ehrman says something very, very interesting, but very, very problematic too. He says we only have Paul's side of the story. So that means that we don't have Jesus' disciples' side of the story. We only have Paul's side of the story. So why should we believe in Paul? That's the $1 million question that needs to be answered. There's no reason to believe in Paul, because like I said, Paul got into fights with the disciples. We can read this in 2 Corinthians. Well, let's read it real quick. Let's go to Bible now. Let's go to Bible. Oops. Let's see. Bible. Yeah, I know I'm using Yahoo, but I'm just trying to make this as quick as possible. Now I'm going to show another very damning verse that I think shows that Paul and the disciples were not teaching the same thing. He says, this is Paul in 2 Corinthians 11. Let's read 4 to 5. Let's read 4 to 5. It says, for if someone comes to you and preaches a Jesus other than the Jesus we preach, or you receive a different spirit from the one we received, or a different gospel than the one you accepted, you put up easily enough. Paul also says, I do not think I am in the least inferior to these super apostles. So Paul and the disciples are preaching a different Jesus. You see, he says, preachers of Jesus other than the Jesus we preach. What is the Jesus Paul was preaching? The crucified and resurrected Jesus, right? So he's saying there are apostles, disciples, or the disciples of the disciples who are teaching different gospels and different Jesus than what Paul was preaching, you see? So what is Paul's Jesus? The crucified and resurrected Jesus, right? So, it's very possible that there were disciples preaching a Jesus who was not, killed on the cross and was resurrected. And then it goes back to the Q gospel that talked about Jesus' disappearance. For more on that, I would recommend this book, Daniel A. Smith, The Empty Tomb. So I recommend getting this book, Revisiting the Empty Tomb, the early history of Easter by Daniel A. Smith. This book talks about the Q gospel. It talks about the Q gospel and how the Q gospel talked about Jesus' disappearance, not his resurrection, and the resurrection story was added in later. But again, I'm getting away from the topic at hand. So getting back to the topic, Ehrman says we obviously have only Paul's side of the story. So if we have only Paul's side of the story, and we don't have the disciples of Peter, the disciples being Peter, James, John, etc., side of the whole early history of the church, then why should we believe in Paul? Why should we just have this one-sided story where, it's just Paul's, version of events, and we don't have the disciples' version of events when it came to the early church and the history of the early church history and what the disciples were teaching, etc. So this is a big problem, which Ehrman highlights, that, we only have Paul's version of the early history of early Christianity. So this is a big problem for understanding or trying to reconstruct what was happening in the earliest periods of Christianity, because as Ehrman says, we obviously have only Paul's side of the story. We don't have the disciples' side of the story. So why should we believe in Paul? There's no reason to believe in Paul, and he's the mastermind of the whole Jesus dying and resurrecting movement. And we can say that he's the one who originated Jesus' death and resurrection, not the disciples, because like Ehrman says, rightly points out, we obviously have only Paul's side of the story. That means we don't have Jesus' original disciples or followers side of the story, or their version of events, or their version of their version of Jesus, or their side of the story. We just have Paul's side of the story. So this is a very damning piece of evidence against, the early church and against Paul, because we just have one side of the story. We don't have Jesus' original followers or disciples version of events, or their side of the story. Stay tuned. More videos come up ahead. Debunking Christianity and Paul.